I'm going to tell you a story how the jealousy of a friend leads to his murder. Listen up, 'cause it's treacherous. My name is Cicaut. I am the author, and the story starts now. It is after hours at Medley Park. The sun has already set. Park visitors had already been ushered out by the park's rangers, and the front gates have been closed. According to the rules, at these hours, there should be no people at the park. But that rule is only for people who follow rules. Young teenagers seeking thrill and privacy always managed to sneak in. Their cars couldn't drive in, but there were no gates keeping foot traffic out. They just strolled through, lighting up their blunts, cracking open their liquor bottles, making their way through the woods, and getting it in. Tonight was supposed to be a peaceful night for Dominic. It's his birthday. He just turned 18. The night is supposed to be a night filled with celebration, filled with pleasure, except that it wasn't. Cicaut had taken a hold of Dominic's dreadlocks in a firm grip and wouldn't let go. The two 18-year-old boys had been fighting for the last few minutes. They exchanged punches, kicks, elbows. The fight had gone to the ground several times, all times with Dominic landing on top, and instead of raining down a meteor shower of punches and elbows, Dominic spared Cicaut with mercy. He didn't hit him not once while on top. Dominic was obviously the stronger, better fighter. It wasn't a total beatdown, but the fight was close. Ultimately, Dominic won. He didn't really want to physically hurt his best friend because he had realized he hurt him in a different way. Cicaut was emotionally damaged. Cicaut wanted to go again and again. He didn't want to stop fighting. He couldn't accept the loss. He had taken enough losses at the hands of Dominic, so he persisted. When they clashed the second time, they had tumbled down the slope into the man-made lake of the park. Generally speaking, men don't pull hair in fights. They leave that to the women. At least that's what men say in conversation. But in a real fight, anything goes. Dominic was the first to try to stand up out of the water after the two rolled into the lake. He was bent at the waist, halfway to standing upright, when Cicaut reached up and snatched him by the dreadlocks. Cicaut had no shame in pulling hair. Matter of fact, it was all that he could do. He was so exhausted from all the fighting he was doing. And after all, Dominic had outclassed him, outboxed him, outmatched him. Cicaut allowed his own body weight and gravity to do the work of pulling Dominic back down to the ground. They were in shallow waters, tussling at the very edge of the man-made lake. The water levels where they had rolled into were a few inches above ankle height. At first, Dominic did not perceive a threat. Cicaut didn't either, at least not initially. It wasn't his intentions to use the water as a tool to help him win the fight. But along the way, something clicked in his mind. Most people are intimidated by large bodies of water as a means of drowning. In reality, it doesn't take much fluid at all to drown an individual. All that is required is to cut off the airways. A full-grown, mature adult can drown in a bowl of cereal. It doesn't take much to drown at all. This is a reality that Dominic will unfortunately get to experience. Cicaut had wrapped Dominic's long locks within his hands in such a way that even if Cicaut got tired and loosened up on his grip, he will still be able to maintain control, full control, of Dominic's head. The head that at present is submerged below water along the shores of the lake. Cicaut was lying on his side. He was partially submerged. The water levels was a problem for him too. But with a little bit of effort, because no one was holding his head down, Cicaut could breach the surface of the waves and suck some air into his lungs. Dominic did not have that luxury. No matter how hard he tried, no matter what way he maneuvered his body, his head remained submerged. His neck was no match for Cicaut's biceps. He couldn't outmuscle, overpower his way free. Dominic held his breath as he thrashed and punched, hoping to do damage, but it was no use. Cicaut wouldn't let go. Panic. Panic washed over Dominic like the waves of water above the surface of his submerged head. Dominic could feel fatigue in his neck muscles. They started to give out. The situation was dire. He was desperate. He needed to breathe. Dominic had held his breath for as long as he could, but at a certain point, once his body was fully depleted of oxygen, he took an instinctive, involuntary breath. That would have been the sound made by Dominic if his head wasn't underwater. But instead, the sound was... The murky, dirty water of the lake forced its way in through Dominic's nose and mouth. Once the first gulp of water splashed the inside of Dominic's lungs, it caused a secondary, involuntary reaction. Coughing. Coughing made things worse. Coughing allowed more water to enter in through Dominic's lungs as it expanded and collapsed. The more he coughed, the more water entered in, which automatically caused him to cough some more. It was a vicious cycle. The water felt like acid. It burned his nasal cavity. It burned his trachea. It burned his bronchi, his air pipes. It burned his lungs. Dominic's body started to spaz uncontrollably, jerking and thrusting in random directions. He wanted to breathe, but instead more... In no time, Dominic's lungs had more fluid than his bladder. His lungs were officially water balloons. The strength of his muscles dissipated. His spasms grew faint. 156 billion neurons in Dominic's brain fizzled to a crisp. They burnt out, charred like light bulb filaments. They would never get to light up ever again. The damage had been done. They had been deprived of oxygen for way too long. His vision blurred, faded to black, and his consciousness plunged into darkness. Dominic died on the same date he was born. Cicaut sat up against a tree facing away from the lake. He clutched his right hand with his left hand and applied firm pressure on his right index finger. It hurt like hell. He had lost so much blood, and in spite of the pain, he needed to maintain the pressure in order to prevent himself from bleeding out. Half of his right index finger was missing. It had been bitten off during the drowning. The pain from his partial finger reverberated through his right arm, but Cicaut pressed forward. Cicaut was delirious from blood loss and in shock. What he had just done was such a traumatic experience. Cicaut had drowned the love of his life. Maybe he should allow himself to bleed out. In his heightened emotional state of shock and delusion, memories from his past flittered to the top of his consciousness. Cicaut remembers the first time he had met Dominic. It was the summer between the 7th and 8th grade. Cicaut and Imani were shooting around the basketball court at this very park. Dominic had walked up and challenged them to a game of basketball, 2-on-1. He was so arrogant, Cicaut recalled. When Imani asked Dominic if he was really certain that he wanted to do a 2v1, Dominic's response was so cocky. Two of y'all can't guard me together, so 1-on-1 ain't no challenge, Dominic said. Cicaut and Imani lost 5 out of 5 games that day against Dominic. Dominic was able to back up his trash talk. From the first day they met, Dominic bested him. Another memory surfaced vividly in the mind of Cicaut as he shifted his body against the tree while cradling his right hand. Cicaut remembers the time the three of them were at the mall the summer of sophomore year. Dominic was bragging about how he could pull more girls than Imani and Cicaut. Dominic always found a way to make the simplest thing into a competitive sport, and it irritated Cicaut. And once Dominic won, which was every time, he would brag and boast without ever stopping. Cicaut found himself the butt of Dominic's jokes that day. Out of the three of them, Cicaut had gathered the least phone numbers. Imani came in second, and Dominic came in first, of course. Cicaut was sick and tired of losing to Dominic. He hated that Dominic made everything a competition. It infuriated him. Cicaut's grip on his index finger had tightened. The momentary anger had caused a lot more strength to surge through his left hand's grip. His clothes were soaked with water and his own blood. And it's a good thing it was summertime. Winter conditions would have turned his soaked clothing against him. Cicaut checked his bitten index finger to see how it was doing. It still looked just as bad as when he first checked it, so he squeezed it again and allowed the pain to surge through his body. As Kiwan pressed his back hard against the tree to brace the pain, another memory flittered into the top of his consciousness. This memory in particular had brought Kiwan and Dominic closer together as friends. Dominic had displayed a compassionate side of himself to Kiwan. He was there to comfort Kiwan during one of Kiwan's lowest moments. Kiwan had been rejected by his crush. The two of them were alone at the park bench. Dominic had his arms around Kiwan's shoulders as Kiwan cried his eyes out. Dominic had assured him that things would be all right, that he shouldn't stress, that Kiwan shouldn't worry about it. He'll have other opportunities. The way that Dominic comforted Kiwan in Kiwan's absolute moment of vulnerability was the precise reason that Kiwan was so furious when he saw them. Kiwan had gotten a text message that read, "Birthday sex?" And then immediately after received another text message that said, "Sorry, ignore that, wrong person." Kiwan knew through conversation that Dominic was going to be at the park for his birthday. He always thought that it was weird that Dominic didn't want him there. Dominic refused for Kiwan to attend the celebration. It was weird because the two had bonded so closely in recent times. Kiwan had a hunch, so he showed up to the park regardless. It was after hours at the park. The sun had already set and the usuals were already gone. Kiwan made his way to the usual hangout spot, and that's when he saw them. On his approach, Kiwan heard her moaning before he saw her. Imani was on all fours, bent over by Dominic as he clapped her cheeks loudly. They were out there in the open, fully illuminated by moonlight. Kiwan was not able to contain his emotions, and it didn't help that he didn't take his medication that day. Kiwan felt violated, disrespected, rejected, betrayed. His eyes witnessed a reality that his mind so desperately wished was a nightmare. The moon was so bright that Dominic and Imani noticed Kiwan the moment he stepped from behind the bushes to reveal himself. Imani was furious. "What are you doing here?" she yelled as she quickly covered up her body and placed her clothes on. Dominic's reaction was the total opposite of Imani. His expression, his emotion, was apologetic. Dominic knew how much of a crush that Kiwan had on Imani. After all, he was there to comfort Kiwan when Imani rejected him. Imani and Kiwan had been next-door neighbors. They had been neighbors since they were tiny little kids. Their close proximity is what started their friendship. Kiwan had not known Imani to show any type of attraction to men until Dominic came around. Kiwan secretly envied Dominic for that reason. He hated the fact that Dominic was able to capture the eye of his crush without even trying. Dominic was the better man. He had beaten him again, but this time, it hurt. Kiwan remembers how his heart shattered when he received the accidental birthday sex text message. The text had been sent by Imani. When she immediately texted back, "Sorry, wrong person," Kiwan understood precisely who she meant to text it to. Imani was such a tomboy. She was so cool, so chill. She was one of the bros. She was just as likely to turn her head to look at a fat ass than any man that Kiwan knew. Imani was so masculine in her demeanor that it would be easy to forget that she was a woman. Easy to forget, that is, until you notice them tig old biddies, slim waist, and thick old booty that she hid beneath shaggy, baggy men's clothing. Imani had two sides to her, though. When she hit that switch and went into girl mode, she was alluring. Her face was so pretty. Imani's face was one of the most beautiful faces that Kiwan had ever laid eyes on, and it broke his heart to watch her face as he submerged it beneath the dirty, murky waters of the lake. Kiwan had drowned Imani also, and in the process, Imani had managed to bite off half his index finger on his right hand. Kiwan rested his back against the tree, facing away from the lake. He wanted to avoid looking at the two bodies as they floated like turds. Kiwan didn't bother to run. He knew the police was coming. They were on their way for sure. Imani had managed to call 911 as he drowned Dominic. Had Kiwan been mentally stable, he would have understood that he deserved all that was coming his way. But instead, Kiwan felt that his actions were justified. He had graduated high school only to flunk straight into prison.